So for more than 20 years now, and especially after the Israeli siege in 2007, the Gaza Strip, one of the most densely populated areas in the world, has been facing extremely dire humanitarian and economic conditions. 2/3 of the population live under poverty. The unemployment rate hovered around 50%. You know, Jami, last year I was joking with my younger cousin who lives in Rafah. She graduated from college, and I was teasing her that her possibility of finding a job is a mere 15%. And that's because the unemployment rate for women in Gaza who are under the age of 25 is 85%. That's the unemployment rate for that age bracket. 80% of the families are in need of some form of humanitarian aid to survive, and more than 90% of the water supply in Gaza was declared, quote, unfit for human consumption. Back in 2009, the UN had declared that Gaza is increasingly becoming unlivable. So guys, this is before October 7th. Since then, Israel has dropped 66,000 tons of explosives. That's roughly 3 to 4 atomic bombs on this small, narrow strip of 140 square miles. 360,000 housing units were completely or partially destroyed. 395 schools, 400 mosques. As a result, as of last week, there were more than 28,000 confirmed Palestinian deaths, including 12,300 children and 8,400 women. The World Health Organization documented 350 Israeli attacks on healthcare facilities and ambulances. Every day now, patients are dying in the Nasser Medical Complex due to the lack of electricity. Tens of people have died out of cold and hunger, to the extent that, especially in the northern part of Gaza, they're now using animal feed for bread. Just yesterday, the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights said it had received information that Palestinian women and girls have, quote, reportedly been arbitrarily executed in Gaza, often together with family members, including their children, end quote. Recently, Israel has doubled down on its plans for a ground invasion of Rafah, where the last refuge of Palestinians is, where roughly 1.5 million Palestinians are living, despite the ICJ ruling in January and despite warning calls from virtually every country in the world. Now, yes, our aim today is to locate these events in their historical and political economy context. So what has unfolded cannot be seen in a vacuum, especially a historical one. Professor Khalidi, you and many other scholars have suggested that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is best understood as a case of settler colonialism, emanating from European origins and connected to European anti-Semitism in many ways. Can you elaborate on the historical instances that led to this conclusion, and why? Why is it useful today to read the conflict through a settler colonial lens?
Well, thanks for, is this working?
Yes.
Switch on. Yes, thank you. Thanks for the question. Thanks for organizing this, all the organizers. There are so many of them. And thank you all for being here. The attempt to isolate what's happened since the 7th of October, as if it's some sort of incident standing outside of history, and that the atrocities that took place on the 7th of October are unique and separate from any context, is the reason why we really have to have context. Because you can't understand any of the events from October 7th onwards, whether the largest single number of Israeli civilian deaths in the history of the State of Israel since 1948, or the largest number of Palestinian deaths ever, without understanding the context. These are remarkable, unique, extraordinary events, but they are only understandable within historical context. As I have argued in my book, The 100 Years' War on Palestine, this is not a conflict that's been going on since time immemorial. There was no conflict between Arabs and Jews before the 19th century. Did not exist, never happened. Nothing that happened previously has anything to do with what has been going on in the past century and a little longer. This is a conflict involving imperialism, the arrival of British imperialism in the Middle East in 1917 in Palestine, the rise of nationalism in Eastern Europe. You correctly suggested that Zionism has its roots in Eastern European nationalism. The rise of the persecution of Jews in Eastern Europe, and the rise of nationalism in the Arab world. It's a conflict between two national movements, but it's also a conflict between imperialism, British imperialism first, and a movement backed by British imperialism, which was a national movement, but which was also a settler-colonial movement, a settler-colonial project. This is not some kind of nasty anti-Semitic slur on Zionism. This is how early Zionists understood themselves. Theodor Herzl wrote that he saw the project for a Jewish state as part of a barrier of Europe against the barbarism of Asia. This is the worldview out of which early Eastern European Zionists came. It always saw itself as replacing the indigenous population of Palestine. Herzl didn't write about a Jewish Arab state. He didn't write about a binational state. He wrote about a Jewish state. And in a novel he wrote called Al-Neuland, he basically envisioned a Palestine that was essentially Palestinian free. That was always the idea. The idea was always for a Jewish majority state. And that involved the classic processes of settler colonialism, removing as much as possible of the existing population, taking over as much as possible of the land by whatever means were necessary, and replacing them with a settler population. Now, obviously, the Zionist movement understood itself as having a right to Palestine. It saw itself as resulting from Eastern European or European Christian persecution of Jews going back centuries and centuries and centuries, long before the Holocaust, long before the pogroms of Eastern Europe. All the Jews were kicked out of England in the 12th century. Every single Jewish person in England. Every single Jewish person in France was kicked out of France in the 13th century. The entire Jewish community of Spain and Portugal were kicked out in the 15th century, in the 1400s, late 1400s. This is a many century long process. And Zionism obviously is partly rooted in that. It's partly rooted in a biblical connection of Judaism to the Holy Land. But it is essentially an Eastern European nationalist ideology, which clashes with the rise of nationalism among Palestinians, but it does so, and can only do so, because it had the backing, first of European imperialism, Great Britain in particular, and later on, the backing of the United States. So I think that understanding this as simply a struggle between Arabs and Jews, or as a struggle between right and right, is completely false. It completely elides the fact that without the British, you would not have had the state of Israel. It completely elides the fact that Israel could not fight for one day. It could not bombard Gaza for one day without American 120 millimeter tank shells, 155 millimeter artillery shells, and rockets and bombs for Israeli F-15, F-16, and F-35 fighters, and Apache helicopters. The equipment of the Israeli army is American. The ammunition being used day in, day out is American. Some of it shipped in urgent fashion over the last 2 months, avoiding congressional sanctions. So we are talking about a war not just waged by Israel or by the Zionist movement before that. We're talking about a war waged by the British Empire, together with the Zionist movement, by the United States, together with the State of Israel, in order to do what an early Zionist leader, Zev Jabotinsky, called the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel. This is what the Zionist project was always about. And that's now been enshrined in Israeli constitutional law with the 2018 Israel Nation State of the Jewish People law, which basically says only the Jewish people has the right of self-determination in the land of Israel. That's what this is about. It's about a replacement of an overwhelming Arab majority with what is now a bare Jewish majority between the river and the sea. And those are terms that are in the program of the Likud Party when it won the 1977 election. That has always been the project. In fact, earlier, the revisionist movement wanted Transjordan as well, what is today the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. So I think that without seeing that context, without understanding, for example, that every refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, of which there are 9, it houses people who originally lived in what is today southern Israel. The towns and villages, which we today call Ashdod, which we today call Beersheba, were once called Beersheba, and Asdod, and had Arab populations. The entire Arab population of what is today southern Israel, was driven into the Gaza Strip in 1948. And these are the descendants of those people who used to live in what is today the southern part of Israel. So all of this context, I think, is absolutely necessary for understanding what we are seeing today. And the other part of it I won't go into now. It's the economic and the political and the cultural connections between this country and Israel. Maybe we can get to that at a later stage.
Absolutely. And I think talking about the U.S. and settler colonialism, Professor Lamont Hill, the United States itself, built on a settler colonial project, is today one of the most staunch supporters of Israel. Diplomatically, it used its veto power 34 times to halt the UN Security Council resolutions on Israel, and it led the efforts to revoke, back in the early 90s, the 1975 UN General Assembly resolution that stated that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. Financially, as Professor Khalidi has alluded, it has provided unconditional bilateral assistance and missile defense funding to Israel, totaling $158 billion, more than the US has given to any other country. Other forms include military cooperation. So Professor Khalid is absolutely on point. 80% of Israeli weapons are imported from the US. Others include bilateral trade agreement, business cooperation, and many others. Professor Lamont Hill, can you explain the historical shift that led the US to this current position and why the support is stronger than ever today? And furthermore, how does this direct and indirect military support implicate the U.S. in the genocide case of Gaza today?
Wow, that's a great question. It's fascinating because I was last night, and I echo Rashid's comments regarding everything, but regarding being grateful for this wonderful event and all the organizers who helped make this happen, and to be on the panel with such esteemed colleagues is always a pleasure. Yesterday, there was a note that came out that the U.S. had formed a draft agreement to potentially call for a temporary ceasefire in Gaza. And I was shocked, and so many of us were shocked. That should seem like an intuitive, common sense move. If anything, it just falls short of a full ceasefire, and so it's a strategic maneuver to sort of push back against other ceasefire resolutions that may come before the UN Security Council, particularly coming from North Africa. But the fact that the US intervening with just a temporary ceasefire is seen as an extraordinary act of political risk or courage by US standards, similar to an Obama administration just abstaining from a vote. After a long tradition of vetoes, says everything about the US's relationship to the state of Israel and its complicity in the Settler-Colonial project, and particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, and certainly in the 21st century. But to your point, Rashid's point, it hasn't always been that way. You know, the U.S.'s relationship to Israel is a complex one, it's an evolving one. But if there were a unifying thread among all the kind of colonial relationships here, it's economic interest. And military interest as well, but it's still bound up in economic interest. Often when we talk about the settler-colonial project, many Zionist counter-arguments will be that it's not a settler-colonial project because there's no colony, right? That there's no traditional colony that comes in and takes over and settles in this space. They're wrong. It's a more complicated settler-colonial project, but it's nonetheless a settler-colonial project because the Israeli colonizing project can only happen with the approval, the sanction, the power, the oversight, the weaponry, the economic funding of, at the time of the British Empire. And the British Empire had a very particular economic interest and strategic interest, similar to what the United States is now, in overseeing what at the time was the British mandatory Palestine. And so the British wanted to be there, they just didn't want to physically be there, right? They wanted what they call empire on the cheap. So this was a way to have an outlet in the Middle East, an outpost in the Middle East, to have a strategic sort of oversight of the Middle East, but to allow other people to rule it. And so who ruled it was less important to the British. Who oversaw the day-to-day management of it was less important to the British, and the fact that they had strategic outposts that they could control. Over time, the U.S. became the hegemon, and the U.S. became the strategic power that wanted to do the same thing. And when you look at the U.S.'s relationship to Israel and its support to Israel, it's shifted over time purely based not on feelings but interests. As UN Resolution 181 is being drafted and the UN Partition Plan is being drafted, the U.S. was somewhat ambivalent on the question. There was strong sympathy, for example, with the quest for a Jewish homeland, to be sure. Or let me take a step back. There was certainly sympathy with the plight of the Jewish people around the globe, with pogroms and anti-Semitism, particularly after the rise of Hitler to power. But that same U.S. nation state certainly didn't want them here, right? The UK didn't want them here. The U.S. had a long-standing immigration or anti-immigration policy that not only excluded Eastern European Jews, but also excluded other folks, Irish, Italians. The U.S. was pretty committed to not having immigration for decades. And so what do you do when you have sympathy and you have interest, but you also have deep anti-Semitism and xenophobia that doesn't allow you to have people here or in the West at all? And so this becomes part of the calculus for the United States. But there's another calculus here as well, which is if there is not just a kind of vocal support for this growing Jewish nationalist movement, but also material support, money, weapons, etc., what does that do to a very scary, looming possibility of a Russian-Arab alliance? And so the United States was always being very strategic in saying, well, wait a minute here. We have sympathy for a Jewish homeland, but we also don't want to compromise military interests, we don't want to compromise oil interests. And so we have to be very careful about how we navigate this. I mean, President Truman, history tends to romanticize and sanitize these narratives, but the Truman administration in particular was, again, Truman's advisors, both his campaign manager, ultimately his special presidential advisor, as well as the Secretary of State, were both very much against full-throated support for the Israeli state for these military and economic strategic interests or reasons. And so ultimately, when the United States offers an endorsement and acknowledgement of Israel on its first day, and the United States will now hastily and happily tell you that how quickly it endorsed Israel's statehood, the part that gets left out of that story is how much behind-the-scenes struggle there was over this very matter. As we move over time, we begin to see this change. And it changes for multiple reasons, but always about the looming, about potential alliances and relationships. And so after the Suez Crisis, just to give you, I'm fast forwarding here because there's a lot of points here. This is a very complicated and messy relationship. But after the Suez Crisis, up until the Suez Crisis, the U.S. relationship still wasn't one where you would say they were always in lockstep with Israel. In fact, the Suez Crisis is probably the last sort of full-scale, global, prominent moment where the U.S. is pushing back against the tripartite aggression that's happening. So then the United States is concerned about potential alliances with Russia and Egypt. And so again, it's what do we do against the backdrop of these other threats? How is our own economic and military interest played out here? It's when you get to the Kennedy administration that it starts to get more interesting. That's when you first hear the language of this, the special relationship between the United States and Israel. It's really special because it involves Hawk missiles. And so often, even now, as we talk about the peace agreement, right? I mean, Jared Kushner loves to talk about the peace agreement. Trump loves to talk about peace agreements. We call them weapons agreements back in my day. It's just weapons. These are defense contracts. These are weapons deals. These aren't peace agreements. Think of the countries that we're having peace with. I know war. We can finally we can sleep at night knowing that Morocco and the United States, or Morocco and Israel, or Bahrain and Israel won't have any more, large acts of belligerency. It's like, what are you talking about here? Right? This is about weapons. It's about money. And so under the Kennedy administration, we began to see the birth of the language of special relationship and a kind of commitment to economic support for Israel in a different way. Over time, you've seen, since in the 70s and 80s, you began to see large-scale efforts and particularly policy moves that committed to Israel, economic support for Israel for decades at a time. You saw a commitment to giving Israel a qualitative military edge, which is a commitment to saying that we will always fund Israel to such an extent that the Israeli state will have a qualitative military edge, i.e. stronger weapons, better defense systems than its neighbors. This is all, again, part of the equation here. And so to tie that all kind of connects to the current moment, which is just a continuation of that moment. We continue to provide Israel with extraordinary levels of support, but the support isn't just weapons. It's not just defense systems, it's also political cover. When you look at how many times the U.S. has used its veto power ever on the UN Security Council, half of them are to defend Israel. The United States goes to extravagant lengths to defend Israel from allegations of being. I just watched Bernie Sanders 2 days ago, a progressive champion. Do backflips with a British journalist to not say that it was genocide. He said, well, we don't have to worry about definitions. Who cares about definitions? I don't have to define things. You should say, is this a genocide? He said, well, who cares about definitions? It's just really bad. And he said, would you support a boycott? He said, well, I'm very uncomfortable with boycotts. Boycotts make me uneasy. He said, well, what about South Africa? Did you support that? He said, oh, yes, because that was an apartheid state. He said, what about this one? He said, I'm not good with definitions. I wish I could say that that's an outlier. That's the type of rhetorical and political sophistry that underpins the U.S. relationship to Israel that is always about economic support and military interests. And that is continuing until this very moment. And for that reason, you are going to see, I would imagine, more and more attempts to not just hold the United States accountable in a kind of abstract theoretical sense, but in international legal bodies, international legal fora, you're going to see, I would imagine, the U.S. held accountable for war crimes and complicity. You cannot cut UNRWA. This is the last thing I'll say. I'm sure it's been more than 10 minutes. The United States has cut funding from UNRWA on the most thin and spurious of charges, or allegations, right? Which is that initially there were 12 UNRWA employees out of 30,000, right? Who somehow were involved in the October 7th attacks. Then the number drops to like 6. Then it's like 4, right? And then when you look at the dossier of information, there's nothing there. But they said, a priori, we're going to cut the funding upon investigation. On the very day where an International Court of Justice has just said that it's plausible that Israel is complicit in all kinds of violations and contraventions of international law, not to mention numerous other incidents. So they said, well, we'll wait and let the courts play this out. So Israel gets the benefit of what really isn't much help, whereas UNRWA does not. And so when you see that differential, it's another piece of evidence to say that the U.S. is active and intentional in its efforts to support the Israeli government and the deprivation of Palestinian rights, and ultimately what meets the textbook, legal, any reasonable measure of or index of genocide we see right now happening in Gaza. And the U.S. is entirely complicit in it, both for the long stretch of these 100 years, but also in this immediate moment.
Thank you so much. And being a graduate of the New School just makes me proud for us to connect the idea of power dynamics with economic interest, and this idea of political economy, understanding that economics is a multidisciplinary kind of approach that is necessary for all of us to understand. I do want to stick with this political economy aspect, Professor Khalidi. Although that Settler-Colonial project was not necessarily economic in its nature, it did benefit greatly from its plunder of land and natural resources. preferential treatment of the British mandate, including tariff policies, monopolies. I was talking with Raja about this in detail yesterday, and from access to cheap Palestinian labor and consumer markets. So at one point during 1987, 40% of the Palestinian labor was forced to work in the Israeli economy. Before October 7th, up to 200,000 Palestinians used to work there, and 70 to 80% of Palestinian trade is with Israel. So Professor Khalidi, can you tell us how the Zionist movement and later the State of Israel has benefited economically from the British mandate's policy, the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and later on its relationship with the US? And what does that entrenched dependency, Palestinian-wise, on the Israeli labor and goods market mean for the possibility of any viable Palestinian economy?
That's okay. Well, as you pointed out, the mandate for Palestine, which Britain received from the League of Nations, was both politically and economically designed to favor the Zionist movement. If you read the mandate, not one of its articles applies to the Palestinians. The word Palestinians, the word Arab, it doesn't exist in the mandate. The wording of the Balfour Declaration is the preamble to the mandate. So the mandatory is enjoined to carry out the Balfour Declaration, which is to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine. And about 7 or 8 of the articles, of the 20-odd articles of the mandate, are devoted to things like immigration, land purchase, and other initiatives whereby the British are supposed to favor the establishment of a Jewish national home, which British politicians told Chaim Weizmann, who was the successor to Theodore Herzl, by which they always meant a Jewish state. And the idea was once you have a majority, you take it over. And until then, you would prevent the Arab majority from having political control. So it both was legal and political and also economic, in that it enjoined close settlement on the land. The mandate wrote the land laws such that they would favor the Zionists, and they gave them preferential treatment in terms of monopolies, electrical and other monopolies, and other economic inducements. The Zionist movement wasn't dependent economically on the British, however. One of the interesting differences between the Zionist project and every other Settler-Colonial project that I know of is that it was independent of its, it was an independent project. It had its own funding. It had its own political leadership. It had its own national objectives. That wasn't the case when the English sent English people to Ireland. They were an extension of the English population. The English crown was taking over Ireland, the lordship of Ireland, later the kingdom of Ireland, for the monarch in London. When the French went to Algeria, it was an extension of France and an extension of the French population. This wasn't the case with the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement was an independent movement. It engaged in a transactional relationship with its metropole, with Britain. Each got something from the relationship. As you mentioned, there was a strategic interest on the part of Britain in controlling Palestine because of the route to India, because of the economic and strategic benefits that accrued to Britain from control of the route to India. That meant control of the Suez Canal. It also meant the control of the Mediterranean terminus of the shortest land route between the Mediterranean and the Gulf. And on that land route, which Britain made sure was under British control, if you look at the map, you'll see this strange arm sticking out of Jordan eastwards, and this strange bulge sticking out of Iraq westwards. And so if you connect Haifa and Basra, what you find, the shortest land route between the Mediterranean and the Gulf, is all under British control. And Palestine is essential for that. It was the Mediterranean terminus of what at that time was intended to be a railway, later on became a road, later on became an oil pipeline, later on became a string of air bases running across the desert from Palestine to Kuwait. So the British were gaining something economically and strategically from Palestine. And the Zionist movement was gaining something in political and legal terms, as well as in economic terms, from the British mandate. Shifting to later support of other powers for the Zionist project. I think you laid it out pretty well, actually, Mark. There's not much I would say about American support for Israel, except that it was both at the outset economic aid, and remember, economic aid is money, our tax money allocated by our Congress for another country to spend the money in the United States and enrich American industries. So it's aid to American industry via a foreign country. So economic aid to Israel was not economic aid that the Israelis got to spend on social services. It was economic aid that the Israelis got to spend on American products or American services. And that has transitioned into solely military aid, and we see the benefits for Israel of that military. They have free F-4 Phantoms back in the 60s and 70s. They have free F-16s. They have free F-15s. And today they have the most expensive warplane on earth, free F-35s. They're about to get another squadron of them. So this is obviously a benefit to American war industries, but it's obviously also a benefit to Israel. So, everybody profits. We lose, the taxpayers. The Israeli military gains, and General Dynamics, Lockheed, Raytheon, and so forth also gain. I would add one other means in which the United States benefits Israel economically. And this is by allowing charitable status to agencies and organizations which are essentially the basis of the illegal settlement of Palestinian land. Most of these settlements are established with private funds and Israeli government funds. Those private funds come from this country, from 501c3s, which are tax exempt, and which enable donors in the United States to pour money into the illegal process of theft and colonization of Palestinian land at the expense of the rest of us who pay our taxes, whereas they get these 501c3 charitable tax deductions. So this is another major conduit of American financing to Israel via tax deductions, which donors like the former president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, he's one of the major backers of one of these huge 501c3s. I believe the former president's ambassador to Israel, Ambassador Friedman, was another one. There are several of these individuals who are prominent in the Trump administration who are big funders of these 501c3s. And you have enormous settlements like Mattei to the east of Jerusalem, like Zion on the route to Hebron, like Kiryat Arba near Hebron, near Khalid, which are funded by specific American 501c3s. So this is another means whereby the United States finances and supports Israel, indirectly in this case.
Thank you, Professor Khalidi. And I guess Professor Lamont Hill, Professor Khalidi has discussed that economic relationship between Israel and the U.S. I want to remain on the political economy question, but zoom in on the Palestinian economy, keeping that focus there. Between 1967 and 1987, so 20 years in the occupation, the majority of Palestinian labor before that were self-employed in agriculture. So what happened is this major class transformation in those 20 years. After losing their capital, right, their land, it was the owner-renter relationship, they became wage workers in Israel, mostly in the construction sector. So as Marx would say, they now only had their labor to sell. One benefit from that reserve army of Palestinian labor is that it helped quell kind of the conflict between Israeli Jewish capital and Jewish labor in Israel. So it allowed various strata of Jewish society, Mizrahi Jews, for example, to climb that social ladder using that surplus labor of Palestinians. How do you read within that context Israel's recent decision to replace Palestinian workers with foreign workers, given that structural role that Palestinian workers play? And do these efforts clash with this characterization of Israel as a Jewish state, a homogeneous Jewish state?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. I can turn the microphone on. Yeah, there we go. Okay. You're good. I would start with the end of that question. So none of these economic arrangements compromise Israel's character as a Jewish state. if anything, these economic arrangements are what enabled the construction and maintenance of the Jewish state. Using a settler-colonial framework is super important. I think we also have to look at this simultaneously through the lens of racial capitalism. And I think that's important to take out of that kind of Cedric Robinson Black radical tradition, a kind of understanding, not that there are moments where race intersects with capitalism, or that capitalism is used to intensify the categorization of race or the process of racialization, but rather to understand that all capitalism is racial capitalism. And so all of these, Israel becomes sort of an example par excellence of that. The construction of the Jewish state happens through a set of not just political moves, but also a set of economic arrangements that are bound up in this, right? One is, it would be intuitive to assume that that making land public, for example, would keep it out of the hands of oligarchic power, to prevent it from being isolated. But what happens if you construct a Jewish subject in contrast to a racialized Palestinian other who is not permitted citizenship, who is not legible as a subject or as a citizen of the Jewish state, then public land, because the private land is in Palestinian hands largely, right? And the public land then becomes a way to say, yeah, it's open to anybody who is us, and you're not us. And so, as a result, when you combine that with the Jewish National Fund, when you combine that with other sort of institutional mechanisms designed to fuel Jewish immigration, at this point largely from Europe, but also to ensure the purchase of certain funds, certain land, and to also to create laws and mechanisms to ensure that the land stayed in the hands of this growing, the leadership, right, which is growing at this moment, with the intention ultimately of having a Jewish majority. So this happens with the construction of a racialized Palestinian subject or other. So now you're talking about, I want to fast forward a bit because there's a lot to talk about between that moment in 1967, what you're talking about. One might think that in 1967 that Palestinians would be cut off from the labor force in Israel, but that was very much not the case. You saw, particularly with the cutting of ties from Egypt and Jordan in the aftermath of the 67 war, you saw more Palestinians begin to labor in Israel. The numbers go up. Couldn't stay overnight, right? Couldn't work overnight. You had to go back. You might be working in Tel Aviv, which is often one of the places they work. Also in Haifa, they work in Beersheba. But if you're in Tel Aviv, but you're going back to Ramallah, right? Every day, right? But this labor force was growing, and they did certain kinds of work. They did the work that no one else wanted to do, that other people didn't want to do. Now, again, this is against the backdrop of another racial hierarchy, because you have the Ashkenazi and you have the Sephardim. The Ethiopians didn't get there yet, largely because almost none got there to the 80s. I always joke, they're like, look at this rescue scene of us rescuing, look at our Aliyah. It's like, yeah, why did everybody else's pictures in black and white? Yours in color. Why? Because it happened 40 years later. You did it when you had to. And so you have these different ethnic hierarchies as well. And the labor force was very much dependent on the roles people occupied in the labor force was very much dependent on their racial ethnic categorization. Something else happens in the 1980s. You see an influx of Russian Jews after the fall of the Soviet Union. The first thing that happens there is they start to take on some of these jobs that Palestinians were getting on, or had occupied. There was a narrative among Russian Jews. We don't want the Arab jobs either. This is literally, we don't want the Arab jobs either. So there was an idea that certain forms of labor were reserved for Palestinians. To be very clear, as Palestinians were taking over that work, as Palestinians took over that work even from 1967 to the 80s, the value of that work was diminished. People were paid considerably less. There was much more labor exploitation. People were working harder and harder for less and less money. What you began to see, though, as you move to the 80s, particularly sort of after Russians come in, First Intifada happens, now all of a sudden you begin to see more foreign workers and migrant labor. Now, this is an important point. Foreign workers. Migrant workers are only Jewish migrants. To be a foreign worker, to be a migrant worker, you have to be a Jewish migrant. So the emphasis on foreignness, again, right? You are a foreign worker. Filipinos, for example, were a huge part of the labor market in Israel, working largely with the elderly, some childcare, but largely with the elderly. Saw people from West Africa, from Ghana, from Senegal, working in these jobs as well. Never with the hope of citizenship, right? There's never an idea that you're going to be citizens here. So again, it doesn't compromise the character of the Jewish state at all, because because that work is being outsourced to people who are foreign workers who, by virtue of being part of a Jewish state that defines citizenship or establishes and normalizes citizenship by birthright and by virtue of Jewishness, right? These people will never be citizens. So the Jewish state is actually preserved in this way. And so, I'm sorry, I feel like I'm missing the last part of your question.
No, but I think it was related to that, kind of just talking about then the impact on this homogenous view of a Jewish state of Israel. But actually, I want to stick with you, Professor Lamont Hill, to the next question.
Okay.
Because I do think what you mentioned is very important about that narrative question. And so I want to jump into kind of this current Israeli attack has obviously crossed all red lines, if any existed.
Red line, okay.
Yeah. Many scholars allude to kind of what the October 7th attack meant to the carefully crafted narrative of the strongest security apparatus in the region, and the possibility of Palestinian resistance at all. And so there was an Israeli politician that was quoted, quote, "Muslims are not afraid of us." I think he meant Palestinians. "Muslims are not afraid of us anymore. In order for their fear to be restored, the Israeli military has to turn Gaza to ashes immediately." Which then, talking about Jabotinsky, right? 100 years before that, Ze'ev Jabotinsky, one of the intellectual leaders of the Likud party, which Netanyahu was part of, said, "Zionist colonization," quote, so Zionist colonization must either stop or else proceed regardless of the native population. Which means that it can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall. That was the name of his essay in 1923, which the native population cannot breach. So on top of this, we see this widespread sentiments of support of this new ethnic cleansing and genocide going on in Gaza, with citizens blocking the aid trucks as they attempt to pass into Gaza. And so what are the internal Israeli factors that can help our audience frame this brutal exercise of violence, the widespread acceptance of genocide within Israeli society? And what does that mean for the possible imminent invasion of Rafah, especially in terms of the forced displacement of the 1.5 million people who live there?
Yeah.
So forced them to that. They didn't live there.
Right. Right, exactly. I mean, they didn't live there 2 months ago.
Yeah, there were 250,000 people.
Yeah.
There's 1.5 million now.
Yeah, Rafah holds 250, right? And to watch them go from the north to the center to Rafah, and now being told, some being told to evacuate, go 20 kilometers or 8 miles north of Rafah with no transportation in a dense area. Many of these people are children, many of these people are injured, many people, and there's no corridor, there's no safety corridor. All this stuff is happening, right? And to your point, there are the internal Israeli politics are super fascinating. There's a kind of, the history of the Jewish state is marked by a kind of indifference at best to Palestinian humanity. Right? When you look at the markers of the kind of juridical markers of it, right? When you talk about the Balfour Declaration, for example, as Rashid was just talking about, right? The Palestinians are an afterthought, right? The word Palestine is not, the word Palestinian is
non-Jewish.
Right, non-Jewish, right? When you're talking about these, the civil rights or religious rights, attempting to not compromise the civil or religious rights of this non-Jewish population or this indigenous population, but the word Palestine is not mentioned, the word Arab is not mentioned. This isn't just a rhetorical quibble. This speaks to a broader challenge. You're right. The revisionist Zionist movement, and Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who's kind of the forefather, intellectual forebearer of the Likud party, is critical at the moment where they go from being the sort of the outlier, not the outlier, but by the time you get to the Biltmore Conference, now all of a sudden this is the main game in town. This is the dominant, and it had been the dominant position of the Zionist movement, that we are colonizers. I mean, it's the quote that keeps on giving. When people tell you it's not a Settler-Colonial state, right? You can go to Jabotinsky, the Iron Wall, you can go to Herzl himself. This idea that this is a colonizing project, and that we are going to have to inflict and impose violence in order to create this thing. And we expect that they'll fight back. No, people wouldn't fight back, is their argument, right? But nonetheless, we have to create this in order to create this. And that idea is to effectively say that whatever our national interests and ambitions are, trumps whatever would happen to Palestinian people, right? But it's not just an indifference, because you cannot form a Jewish state without a Jewish majority. You cannot have a Jewish majority, not just without mass immigration, without mass expulsion. The Jewish state is formed through transfer. Israel is formed through transfer and expulsion. And so that's baked into the state project. It's never not. And so when we look at what's happening in Gaza now, in many ways it's eerily similar to what we saw in 1948. I mean, the same family, or often the same families that were kicked out of 48, that were kicked out of Israel, that end up in refugee camps in Gaza are now being told, oh, well, there's a nice humanitarian corridor in Rafah, and you just go through the Rafah crossing, and you'll end up in Egypt, and everything will be fine. You can come back soon. Right. So
bring the keys.
Right. And right. And so in that context, we see the same thing: mass transfer, mass expulsion, but a kind of illegibility or unbreathability, to use Judith Butler's language, of Palestinian lives and Palestinian bodies, which is also part of this, right? In the 1980s, in the war in Lebanon, it was impossible to even get the New York Times to print the names or the number of Palestinian people who were killed. I mean, people were protesting. Edward Said was protesting in front of the New York Times building to get them to print the number of Palestinians who were killed, because it didn't matter. It was a big deal when I worked at CNN. I don't work there anymore. Long story. To even have B-roll and footage of Palestinian people who died, as late as Cass led, or Protected Edge even in 2014. I mean, this is not ancient stuff. There was an idea that we didn't need to see Palestinian death, or maybe that it wasn't worth noting, it wasn't noteworthy. This is all part of the thing, and Rashid began with this point of saying this is not an eternal struggle. Part of why it's important to note that is because that's part of the long-standing Orientalist narrative that these are just barbaric people who perpetually fight, who are always at war, who don't deserve intervention, who don't deserve peace, who don't deserve mercy, who don't deserve even diplomatic intervention. That's the argument, right? That these are barbarians who deserve to just be killed. That's been the argument since October 7th. And so part of what this is a structural issue, right? Part of this is a juridical issue in terms of how Israeli law constructs the Palestinian other. But part of this is a broader kind of discursive question around how we see and read brown bodies, how we see and read Arabs, how we see and read Palestinians, and how we can understand them as being worthy of grief. This is the last thing I'll say. Every Palestinian university has been bombed. In Gaza. There are 12 of them, all destroyed. 370 elementary and secondary schools destroyed. Artifacts, museums, cultural centers, libraries. I mean, this idea of scholasticide is bonkers. Can you imagine this happening anywhere else and the academy not be outraged? The organizations of university professors not outraged? No one's protesting? I mean, we're like 1% of the child population in Gaza has been killed. More people were killed in the first week in Gaza than all of Ukraine. But there's a way that those lives are not mournable, they're not grievable, they're not legible. And that's part of a deeper problem. It's not just restricted to the Israeli state or to Israeli culture. That's a global issue. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And this is going to be the last question. I'm sure there are a lot of questions and comments that people have. And this is for you, Professor Khalidi. There's an increasing debate now on the arrangements for the so-called day after in Gaza. With little input by Palestinians, there's a real danger a framework would be imposed on them. This is not the first time that would have happened. A clear example in the 1980s was the village leagues, which were imposed by Israel and seen by Palestinians and collaborators and traders. Some would argue that even the current version of the PA also lacks legitimacy. The last elections were held in 2007. The recent opinion polls, 2006 and 7, right?
5 and 6.
Yeah, 5 and 6. And recent opinion polls show that 64% of Palestinians oppose the PA meetings with the US on the day after discussions. 88% of Palestinians believe President Abbas should resign, and the satisfaction of the Palestinian Authority is at an all-time low of 14%. So given that, how can we understand these plans and possible imposition of leadership in the historical context of the Palestinian national movement that you know so much of and were part of? And what would it mean for the legitimacy of the PA if it decides to partake in these efforts?
Yeah, well, the Palestinian Authority is an institution with no authority, no jurisdiction, and no sovereignty. It's essentially a subcontractor for the occupation. It primarily provides security for Israeli settlement, projects and expansion of colonization, and for the Israeli civilian population, and for the Israeli military occupation. That's its primary duty. A huge proportion of its budget is devoted to security, and it's not the security of its people, it's the security of the colonists, the settlers, the army, and Israeli civilians inside Israel. And it has a very low degree of legitimacy. It started off as a project that Palestinians believed, many of them, in my view, foolishly, would lead to Palestinian statehood. I've argued in several books that I've written that it was designed not to lead to Palestinian statehood. If you look at the negotiations I was a part of in Madrid and Washington, if you look at the Oslo negotiations that took place behind our backs in secret and then led to the Oslo Accords, if you look at all the negotiations thereafter, at no stage was either Israel or the United States committed to an independent, sovereign, contiguous, sustainable Palestinian state. As Yitzhak Rabin said in his last speech before he was assassinated by an extremist who felt he'd already gone too far in what he had done, what we were offering the Palestinians will be less than a state. And what he said in that same speech was Israel would continue to control the Jordan River Valley, which meant it would control the external envelope of a Palestinian, if you want to call it Pakistan, reservation, quasi-state. But as he said, honestly, in his last speech, less than a state. I would argue that anything that the United States and the white English settler colonies that move in its wake and the former imperial powers and Germany say about a two-state solution, so-called, isn't worth the paper it's written on, because it doesn't involve 2 or 3 essential, absolutely essential elements if you're talking about a state. It does not include ending occupation. The United States doesn't even talk about occupation. It doesn't even talk about it being illegal. Occupation is illegal. 56 years of it is illegal anyway. It doesn't talk about settlements, colonization, the fact that 60% of the West Bank is under Israeli control. And that there are now 750,000 Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem. Without dealing with those issues, and without dealing with the issue of sovereignty, meaning absolute control over your airspace, entry, egress, your population register. The population registers of the Gaza Strip and of the West Bank are in Israeli control. The Israelis decide who's allowed to live there, who's not allowed to live there. If you have a baby, will they register it or will they not? If you marry, will they allow you to marry or will they not? If you want to enter, will they allow you to enter or will they not? If you want to leave, if you want to import, if you want to export, all of those things in the vision that every Israeli leader who's even deigned to negotiate with the Palestinians, whether Rabin or Barak or Ehud Olmert has had, those things would remain under Israeli control. So you'd have some form of Israeli security control, some form of lasting occupation, and therefore no sovereignty, no independence. What you would call it would be whatever Orwellian designation you might choose to apply. Unless and until the United States is talking about that, they're simply essentially talking about a projection into the future of the status quo. The United States recognizing a Palestinian state while occupation and colonization continues is a travesty. And I would argue that's essentially what is on offer, if indeed anything will be on offer, because I honestly don't think that this Israeli government would even accept a continuation of the status quo. The Israeli Prime Minister is talking to me about, in fact, rolling back further some of the prerogatives of the Palestinian Authority and taking complete security control over both Gaza and the West Bank. So I honestly don't think that that is a prospect that we even have to pay very much attention to, though a lot of energy of the media will be wasted on that, instead of looking at what is actually happening in Gaza. 4.5% of the Gazan population of 2.3 million people have been killed, wounded, or are missing under the rubble. 4.5%. We're talking about almost 70,000 people wounded, we're talking about 8,000 people missing, and we're talking about almost 30,000 people dead. Almost all of those are children and women. 70% of them are children and women, and many of the others are older men who have no competent status. So we're talking about an overwhelmingly civilian population, which is being systematically butchered with our weapons. And there's no end in sight. The death rate is 500 to 700, 800 a week, and it continues every week. We're into the 5th month of this. And that's really what's important, not ludicrous visions dangled before quislings and harkies who sit in gilded chairs in Ramallah, but rather the actual continuation of settlement in the West Bank, colonization. The number of people killed in the West Bank is almost 400 since, including almost 100 children, since October 7th. Many hundreds of people have been wounded. Those are the realities, I think, and those are the important things to look at. And unless and until the United States and its allies, its Western European and white settler colony allies in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, change their position, that's not going to stop. The United States vetoed the 3rd consecutive resolution this morning, midday, in the Security Council. So the United States is emboldening, financing, arming, protecting the continuation of this genocide. They are culpable. They're also actually legally liable, and they should be brought to justice. The people in the White House, the people in the Defense Department, the people in the State Department, and the intelligence agencies who are doing this, not just the Israelis. This country, Britain, all of the United States allies who are engaged in this are actually, in my view, should be brought before the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court. Thank you.
And I mean, on that note and that call and that grounding point, I want to say thank you. Panelists for that extremely interesting and informative panel and discussion. And I move the floor now to Professor Dos Santos, who will discuss the Q&A section.